fine dining?
No, chef.
A fine fucking mess!
Hey everyone, this is Jem or Jemerus. As you can tell, I don't go by my old name anymore. Hell's Kitchen has given us 2 decades now of craziness, but not all of its premieres are created equally. Today, I will be ordering, from least favorite to my favorite, the Hell's Kitchen premieres. And there's a few things I need to clarify. First, I'll be ordering them based on my opinions of the quality of the episodes, and that does not strictly factor in how skilled or how bad everyone is in these episodes. Sporadically, over the past couple of years, I've rewatched every premiere cycle of Hell's Kitchen, and for the sake of convenience, 2 episodes will be factored in for seasons 11 and season 17 onwards, because we did not get a boot until episode 2 for any of these seasons. When doing rewatches, I did, as much as possible, try to rewatch the episodes on the official Hell's Kitchen YouTube channel, which omits commercial transitions, next time on Hell's Kitchens, previously on Hell's Kitchens, and the credits, so those will not be factored in here. Being towards the bottom of the list typically doesn't sound great, but I'll honestly say that even the bottom picks were actually not bad, and that deciding upon the order took me a couple of hours just by virtue of how close a lot of these episodes are to each other. And any deleted scenes, such as those from season 3, will not be considered on this list. I will be issuing a spoiler alert for this video, in particular for every first boot of the show, so you have been warned. But now, let's get it started. So at number 23, and you're going to notice a bit of a pattern here where a lot of the bottom slots are occupied by more recent seasons, because I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the modern day format. But yeah, at number 23 is season 20, Hell's Kitchen Young Guns. The modern day premieres tend to be very formulaic. The signature dishes have returned to being private, which I honestly don't mind, I actually like that. But the reward tends to be just like the contestants going to eat with Gordon Ramsay half the time. And there's a lot of kiss-assery when it comes to how they feel about Gordon Ramsay when they go eat with him. Ramsay calls the contestants down for some sort of quirky intro whenever they get to start the Punishment Pass challenge. Like, for example, that time where Jockey was dressed in a Scottish outfit. And then all of a sudden we have a cliffhanger and then we have to wait a whole week. The next episode finishes off said challenge. And then we get to the prep. And the prep I actually like. I like watching the sous chefs explain to the contestants how the menu is going to work for that season. And then we see service, where I feel that given the fact that we have an hour and a half worth of content to work with, not including commercials, I would expect for the service to be a bit longer or a bit more stuff to be shown. But yeah, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of this constantly recycled formula. So yeah, this is one issue I have with season 20 that I'm going to copy paste onto pretty much every season after season 16. My main problem with this season is also the redundancy of a number of annoying little things, such as the idea of veganism being brought up 5 times. I also didn't care for the idea of like expressions like goat and foodies and lit being used a lot, but we could tell the connotations behind it are more to rub it in that these contestants are on the younger side. On the contrary, I did like the past versus future metaphor at the beginning, where we have this museum. Could it have been executed a bit better? Yes. Did I find that it was weird that some of the contestants were shocked by the Joseph incident? Yeah. You know, circling back to the whole repetition thing, like apart from the veganism being brought up a lot, and apart from the millennial and Gen Z expressions like goat being brought up a lot, I think one other thing that gets brought up a lot is women's power. And I thought it was brought up a little too much, especially considering that we just had 7 winners in a row that were all female. I also, on the positive side, I find that Antonio is a person who is kind of funny to watch in terms of how he comes across to his teammates. The problem is that like the season before we just had Mark. And also I find that the mechanic behind the worst dishes for the Punishment Pass was incredibly unfair, because in this case we have the contestants that choose 3 weakest of their teams, and then they end up facing elimination. I will say that one thing I did like about the Punishment Pass challenge, and this is a positive, is that 2 people got passes this time, not just 1 person. Matthew's downfall was fun to watch, even though he should have gone home over Ava. I did like watching Matthew throughout this episode. And so that's all I have to say about season 20. There were a few good moments, but there were also a lot of shortcomings that caused it to just be left at the bottom. At number 22, we've got the season right before, and that is season 19, Las Vegas. Now, once again, we've got the modern day formula that I don't really care for much, which includes the cliffhanger. And it actually would have been lower due to there being more standout negatives, I felt, than season 20. But there were actually a few positives coming from characters that really elevated these 2 episodes. And one of those characters is Mary Lou, who I felt delivered so many confessionals that were really relatable and really delivering it in such a funny way. We had Declan as well. And Declan also had his big D moment during his signature dish challenge. But as far as the negatives were concerned, one thing I didn't care for is the fact that Vegas is being used here. I know they're filming in Vegas, but at the same time, it's got so overused by this point in the show's history that I'm just sitting there like, why Vegas again? And also the cold open would have been fine had it not been for the major spoilers, such as them spoiling the final 8 of the season right off the bat. However, going back to some positives, it was nice to see 2 ex-contestants as sous chefs for the first time, not just one. The mechanic for worst dishes of the punishment pass was better this time than it was for season 20, with the sous chefs tasting because the sous chefs are not biased towards their teammates. They're more professional as far as we're concerned. Though I have to admit, they should not have made the boots so obvious with Kenneth. Also, the challenge elimination aspect, like with season 20, is a bit of a knock. I don't think it's necessarily fair to eliminate a chef after one challenge. And also, speaking of challenges, another issue I had with this premiere was the signature dish challenge in terms of the gambling mechanic that was used. I feel like signature dish challenges should straight up be present your signature dish. If you bring up a gambling component or other components I'm going to mention later when we talk about seasons 18 and 17, they're not exactly signature dish challenge anymore because you're not exactly cooking a signature dish. It defeats the entire purpose. I will say there were a few other funny moments that did elevate this episode a bit, such as Potato Gate. But even in service, there wasn't much going on that was funny except for Mary Lou's confessionals. And I actually felt that Lisa Vanderpump's presence, I don't know if she was putting on a show or whatnot, but it just was kind of distasteful and it was just too much of the pampered person stereotype and it wasn't exactly fun to watch. With that out of the way, we're going to move on to number 21 on the list. And this is actually a season that I do enjoy, but again, we have to base this just on premieres, and that is season 22, The American Dream. Because once again, we've got the modern day formula that I don't really care for, which includes the cliffhanger. I did enjoy, however, the opening where we had 3 special guests come in and talk about their American Dream, and then you had Gordon Ramsay himself coming in. But it was evident very early on that this theme seemed a little bit questionable at the very least. And more, we got very annoyed as viewers with this redundancy of the word American or America. Just this whole theme of America was becoming really overused very fast. And, it was a drinking game. Take a shot if you hear American. As much as this was a talented cast, Jason, Tad, and Claudia were the only real standouts in terms of hilarity. And it was kind of mainly because of their downfalls. And that also leads to a predictable first boot in Tad. I will say that one positive with this premiere is that there were problems in both teams regarding service, which caused both of them to be kicked out, with both of them being forced to stand up 2 nominees, which is always great. However, Jay said to the blue team that this was the worst service ever. Like, what? I've seen worse than this. And given it was season 22, it was in a tough spot because it had 5 seasons to try to not copy from, but we have to be objective here. This did not fly. And that's all I have to say about that. And now we're going to move on to number 20, which is finally a season that's not in this mold of modern day seasons, and that is season 16. And now the reason for which season 16 is the lowest among the 16 first premieres is because as much as there were a number of negative points, there weren't that many positive points that elevated or compensated for those negative points. I liked how the preview was set up with the cinematic theater sneak peek. I also enjoyed the military camp surprise. That was really fun to watch. I loved seeing Jessica and a bunch of other contestants being forced to go through this like boot camp sort of challenge. But then we have some moments such as the signature dish challenge where there was really not much going on. And on top of that, there were a lot of the women who were having mom moments that got redundant after a while. And then out of nowhere, you had Johnny make this random sexist comment. But I will say some positives. I did like that whole sequence during service where Matt was confronted almost Joseph style by Ramsay after letting Andrew walk scallops that he didn't finish. And then when he brought up the cameras, Ramsay was really angry at the blue team during the service compared to premieres that were ranked below this one. But, back to some of the negatives, you had Gia that was there where, if you don't like Elise, you're not going to like Gia. She was kind of like a Timu Elise. And you also had some of the men that were starting to show their problematic sides. It was not as much in the premiere, but still was starting to get shown. And frankly, I was upset with the fact that Pat went home. He was the wrong person to be sent home. Either way, I just felt that with season 16, the number of positives did not compensate for the number of negatives. Now at number 19, we're going to return to a more modern day season with this modern day formula, and that is season 21, Battle of the Ages. Once again, we've got another reunion between 2 contestants that know each other outside the show, which by that point is way too soon considering that within 4 seasons, we've had 3 instances like that. On top of that, we also have this bit where right after the bus, Cheyenne makes this confessional hoping for men versus women as the team setups. I felt that was kind of a forced confessional by producers. However, there were some positives. As much as there was a bit of a spoiler in the cold open regarding the final 9 and who they would be, the previews were fun to watch. We've also got Zeus during his signature dish telling a story about being bitten by a shark, and that was kind of like what paved the road for someone like Tad to come in this following season. But I think another thing that was kind of an odd moment was when they went on the reward, and even though it's a mixed gender team, they still found a way to make an anti-men insult. But speaking of the reward, I will say it was actually nice to see Ramsay being fairly humble on this reward, in spite of it being the same old reward of these modern seasons where Ramsay takes the winning team out to lunch, and there's usually a bit of kissastery, but there wasn't really much of that this time around. There were some of the bad mechanics that were recycled for the worst dish in the punishment pass challenge, but at least Ileana uneliminating herself in a way was a pleasant twist. I enjoyed watching that, so it kind of compensated for it. But part of the reason why this season is actually higher up compared to other seasons around its time is because of the back half of the two parts. You have Nicole's 180 switch. You also have the start of the Alyssa versus Ileana rivalry that takes so much of the screen time for the red team service, and it kind of is a bit of an entertainment point. You also have Billy being Billy, and it could be annoying at times, but there were also other times where it was really funny to watch. And I think what was a big cherry on the cake for this episode was when we get to the nomination scene, and we have Charlene and Billy being the two nominees, but Zeus's actions just were a nice oil to the fire. But in spite of these end-stretch pauses, the fact that this was a modern-day formulaic episode, including the cliffhanger, caused for season 21 to just fall flat in terms of the rankings and be placed at number 19. Now at number 18, we've got season 17 All-Stars. And once again, a knock with this season's premiere is that there's the modern-day formula of splitting into two episodes and having a cliffhanger. However, the first 15 to 20 minutes were just pure nostalgia. The phone calls, especially Benjamin's, were funny. The well-inserted flashbacks, promising cast, and there was a good opening with no real spoilers for the season to come. As I alluded to before, I wasn't a fan of the signature dish twist mechanic that was introduced this season because it defeats the entire purpose of having a signature dish challenge. I would have preferred had Gordon Ramsay just simply said to the contestants, maybe do what you did last time, but elevate it. I also liked the introduction of the All-Star cast to the live audience. And then we move on to the signature dish challenge, which is back to being held privately. And as much as I did appreciate to a certain degree the public signature dish challenge, I do prefer the private signature dish challenges. And that's one thing I do appreciate about the formulaic premiere era that we've been seeing these past 8 years. Another thing I appreciate about the signature dish challenge was the interactions between Gordon Ramsay and the contestants, talking about how have you been? What have you been up to since you've competed last? It was almost like they were sort of friends. Then we get to the end of the signature dishes, and we probably have one of the better moments of the season, in fact, with Robin's signature dish, because it was touted as possibly being one of the better ones, only for us to get psyched out at the last second because it turned out to be actually the worst of all the signature dishes of that season. But then we move on to what would normally be considered the punishment pass challenge. However, in this case, it was for individual immunity, and Millie wins it. And I think the personal thing that was a bit of an insult to my Quebecois heritage is the fact that he calls it poutine. I'm like, bruh, I'm sorry. You can't just take a salad and throw a few fries on it and call it poutine. Anyway, we move on. We see Elise made so many unforced errors and even got the red team in trouble in the sense that she forced them all to go to a table and apologize. As much as it was funny to watch the editors dunk on Elise, it was also funny to watch the irony of Ashley's comment when she says that Elise is crying and she doesn't cry during service when things get tough, only for the editors just to do this big flashback of her crying at the past back in season 15. But the red team in general that night was such a disaster. Deliberation and elimination was fun to watch. The bickering between the women's team was like a reunion of season 10 almost. But, and I think this is more my knock against this whole setup, Ben's diabetes and the timing of his appearance on the show kind of made it seem like he was always going to be the first one to go home. So even though it was unpredictable as elimination, it sort of was, and also it seemed a bit distasteful to people who suffer from diabetes to a certain extent. Anyway. Now at number 17, we have a season that has a premiere that seems very good on paper, but when you actually start to look at the fine details, you realize that it's not as exciting as the premieres that will follow, and that is season 10. And to get the positives out of the way, we've got the opening about the stats over the past 9 seasons going into the 10th, which was nice and iconic to watch. We've got Tavon's downfall, we've got Royce's anchovies, we've got Roshni being kicked out at the beginning of service, but then we have Royce's arrogance just standing out during this nomination ceremony and somewhat actually making the Tavon boot less predictable. Now, the issue with season 10, in my opinion, is that was about it in terms of positives for its premiere. I didn't really find much that made it pop compared to seasons that are going to come up. For example, the shaving of heads sounds like it's going to be funny at the beginning as a surprise, but it's obvious that no one's going to get their head shaved. It's obvious that we're not going to have 18 bald chefs competing. Clemenza's coughing fits kind of were not scaring me or anything because we know he's going to survive. And like I said, this season just didn't really have many negatives. It didn't really have that many positives that could have elevated it higher, which is why it's here at number 17. Now at number 16, and this is the second to last season in this post-16 modern formula era, and that is Hell's Kitchen 18 Rookies versus Veterans. The nostalgia of the first 15 or so minutes was also fun to watch, like with season 17, but at the same time, the Rookies got a good amount of content, and I feel that Survivor shows should really take notes from this because we've got the Rookies and the Veterans getting a decent amount of screen time here. This is kind of what made it more fun to watch than the season 17 premieres. We've got a good start with a group of chefs that seem very accomplished in life, eating a dinner served by the two chefs. But again, we've got the signature dish, and this is a negative point. We got the signature dish twist that is, number one, unfair because the Rookies have an advantage, and it defeats the purpose in terms of the Veterans side. But we can circle back to the positives by noting that there were even more flashbacks that were fun to see, and there were some chefs, such as Scott, that had lines in arrogant confessionals that were good. And the Rookies' entrance song from the reward was, let's be honest, kind of funny as the poor veterans had to do their punishment. The first punishment pass was introduced, and I think the punishment pass is a good twist. It's just not necessarily always executed in the right way. Brett's moments about his parents were nice to watch, but on the negative side, in terms of the punishment pass challenge itself, it became so prominent that it was so predictable that he would win. It didn't have as much impact on me. Service was good though, in the sense that the mistakes were pretty unique, such as tableside being cooked in the kitchen at one point, and another chef using a pencil for some reason. But at the end of the day, Scott's self-sabotaging was just hilarious throughout this whole episode, and the quotes Ramsay made towards him about his elimination were good. Now at number 15, we've got the premiere that I believe I've rewatched the most, admittedly, and that is season 1. And what makes this stand out is that this is the one where it started it all. And you could tell that the show and the production was trying to experiment with how they're going to handle certain confessionals. You can see Ramsay having a number of confessionals as well. And as an American audience, or in my case, a Quebecois Canadian audience, you get thrown into the motions of Ramsay's tough judging and how he has very high standards and how he's not going to mess around. Right into service, you see he flips plates on Chris and Jimmy. He puts an entire tray at Chris's station. And then you have Jimmy's confessional about how he's not going to take shit from Gordon only to get, a plate flipped onto him. And before those events in service, you have the signature dish portion where, for the only time in history, Ramsay is the one who's closer to the kitchen. And there's an entire sequence there that's just really funny. And going back to service, you have something take place that in general is kind of a gem in the earlier seasons and sadly isn't really a thing anymore. And that is Ramsay having an interaction with a customer who goes up to the past to complain. One other thing that makes this season stand out is that there is minimal music during service and less dramatic editing. But the downside to that is that even though it is true that there's a lot of times where we would just prefer to watch that than to watch over-edited music during a service, there's a lot of times where that sort of editing can be executed right, and it's actually more entertaining for us viewers. The end of service was kind of funny where the red team loses because over half of the diners had a below average experience and only one dessert went out, but it was well liked, yet Jeff sucked as a waiter and no one liked him, and 2/3 of his tables left early. But after that, the episode kind of became a slog. The thing about the season and the reason why it's at number 15 is because as much as this premiere set the right tone with regards to Ramsay and his standards, and a lot of firsts were executed, there were a few things that felt a bit empty. I still liked this episode. It's a matter of there were 14 episodes, in my opinion, that were just executed better, in my opinion. Now at number 14, we've got another season that's listed more towards the middle because it just didn't pop as much as other seasons, and that is season 15. Now we've got a nice Vegas tour and show towards the beginning, but again, by this point, Vegas had been overused. I will say that the signature dish is actually one of the better ones setup-wise, in the sense that it was the only one that was actually done in the Prize restaurant. And on top of that, the cast backstories were some of the most diverse. You also had some good service moments that contributed to the flow of the episode. You had Vanessa just flopping over and over and over on pizza, and then cutting it still after it was rejected. You had Alan moving on to entrees prematurely for some reason, and there was even a point where you had a bunch of chefs just jumping on apps on the red team to the point where there's just a counter that pops up on the screen counting 6 chefs. Joe even says at one point that Alan and Kevin are farting a Fat Factory. That was something worth laughing at. So service itself was kind of a fun moment, but still there weren't as many standout moments that elevated this episode in terms of how it would place on this list. And also the elimination was very predictable, plus it happened to a chef that was purple. That felt like Mark should have gotten more content if he was going to be eliminated first. But that's pretty much it, and that's all I have to say about season 15. Now at number 13, we've got a season that is very popular, and once again, I'm not trying to judge the season here. I'm just trying to judge the premiere, and that is season 6's premiere. And it has the formula to be higher on this list, but you could tell that there was so much that seemed forced and engineered through this episode that I just felt like I had to keep it lower. This was admittedly one of the best openings. You had the solar system that was being used as an editing tool, and you had JP just waiting for the bus like, you know, that meme of Mr. Bean just waiting in a field or something. I appreciated the little surprise before the Signature Dish Challenge, where the contestants walk in and there are these videos of previous contestants giving advice to the current contestants playing. The only criticism I have for that is that only 3 videos were shown. And of those 3 videos, 2 competed in the same season, so I would have wished for a bit more variety there. Moving on to the Signature Dish Challenge, we had something that was a positive, which is that this is the first Signature Dish Challenge in which the teams are competing for points and competing for reward. We had Heather's return as a sous chef, but Heather seems so like out of it in terms of her wanting to be there that it kind of felt like a letdown this season, and you could tell it began in this premiere. So I think the surface is where it really picks up, but like I said, there's over editing. There's a lot of things that seem kind of forced here, and one of them is when Louis' ejection happened. It was fun to watch, but you could tell that this was obviously forced. And Robert's welcome back was right after that. Come on. If there's one other thing I would have to knock, it's kind of what happens after the service. You have the red team nomination that happens. The red team getting portrayed as like this sinking ship compared to the blue team, even though I felt that both teams were pretty equal in terms of their mistakes. And on top of that, you had Melinda's mistakes. I felt that they really honed in on just like 1 or 2 things she might have done instead of giving us a bigger picture. But that's all I have to say about season 6. It's still a good season, though. It's just the premiere ranks at number 13 for a reason. Now, number 12, we've got, funnily enough, season 12. And this season was difficult to place because it had what I felt was a weak first half, but a very strong second half. In the Battlefield theme opening, we got what feels now like the same recycled conflict previews being shown in every cold opening. You have Joseph going after Ramsey and saying, "Let's step outside." You have Elise saying to Carrie, "You better get out of my face." You have Tiffany slapping the bottle off the table and calling Barbie an idiot. Like, we see that in almost every premiere by this point. But on a positive, we have the flash mob surprise that was kind of fine, but I don't think it did much to elevate the episode. The signature dishes were fairly decent, though the reward that followed had too much kissastery, a bit like in the modern seasons. But, you know, like I said earlier, the second half of the show is where things really started to get strong. The service was where things really kicked off. You had Gaurav's performance on risottos, which came with ironic confessionals. You had also the debacle between Joy, Nicole, and Sandra on the red team, which includes Joy having a 45-second lobster challenge where the 3 girls just get kicked out for that. Both teams lost service, and the men were kicked out, and both teams had to send up 2 people for a nomination, which was a good thing in terms of entertainment. So that's all I have to say about season 12. I just felt there were pauses towards the end, but I don't think it brings it up past number 12. Now at number 11 is season 9, which has a cold opening that seems modeled off of season 8's, which we will get into a bit later on, with the exception of us getting a compilation of unlocked doors opening from previous seasons when the narration came on about the dream. It sounds good on paper, but it's a bit too spoilery in practice for new viewers who had not seen those previous seasons. But the signature dishes this year were really a good watch, in particular Carrie and Krupa's. But Jonathan being threatened with expulsion just didn't fool anybody, so I think there's a little bit of a knock for that. And unlike season 8, I felt that Jason's exit was better than Antonia's because at least Will was being supportive, and we saw him being a leader right away, as opposed to Sabrina, who just got highlighted for being really unkind about Antonia's state of being. Part of where this premiere falters, in my opinion, is just Elise being Elise in general, and Paul having a couple of moments where he was being too try-hard with his commitment and leadership, but in an annoying way. But we move on to service, and Ramsey getting angry at Elise on the red team for the first time was satisfying to watch. Both first tickets had funny moments, but the service was unique in the sense that 3 men, in total, were told to go eat their mistakes at the same freaking time. And on the other side, we had Elise also being told to eat her mistakes. And then later on in service, you had a bunch of dirty pans being shown on the men's side, which prompts Ramsey to just shut down the kitchens altogether as customers were walking out. But then we get to the post-mortem moment after service, and I think we see something a bit unique here in the sense that right away in the premiere, we see Carrie and Elise fighting, and then we see Paul and Brandon fighting on the blue side. And then we fast forward to the elimination ceremony, and 3 men were nominated instead of 2, which adds an element of surprise to the episode. But ultimately, it was Steven who was given the boot. And I have to admit that I like the shock percussion and music that were used surrounding his elimination than the usual ones. That's pretty much all I have to say about season 9. It was clearly modeled off of season 8 and season 7's premieres. It was a good premiere in itself. However, season 8 and season 7 were better, as we'll get into the discussion of those 2 seasons a bit more down the road. Coming in at number 10 is an unforgettable premiere of a forgettable season, and that is season 13. And we start off the season with a cold open that talks more about how the chefs come from all walks of life. And we see that in the montage. We see a flash of each season 13 portrait. Also, the previews for what's to come and also what has happened in the past are so far some of the best in these Hell's Kitchen premieres. We see footage of Santos carrying a pig. We see footage of Scott from season 12 screaming, "Very important person," on repeat. And then we get up to the live moment, and it was basically Ramsay doing a speech about how HK launched careers such as Christina, Paul, and Jay Santos. And we see footage of the contestants accepting the invitation to HK, the contestants of this season. Ramsay tells them the prize will be big and to not squander the opportunity. But then we get straight to the signature dishes, and there's not much that's noteworthy here, to be honest, except for JP's odd situation about put up his dish early, and then when he presents it turns out it's a 1 out of 5. The reward, the punishment, and the beginning of service were a little subpar, and I think that's what's kind of lowering its placement on this list. There are some good service quips regardless. 2 times 5 Janae. And also, the best part of service was when JP and JR were called just pathetic and just ridiculous, respectively. And it's always a nice touch to see Sterling being Sterling in the middle of service. Even though the men didn't have the worst opening of all time, it was still bad, and the women seemed to have the best. The contrast was so strong that there was no postmortem. Ramsay just straight up told the men to come down to the stairs, and in the stairway he told them disaster due to nominees. And in spite of JP's boot being a teensy bit predictable, it was a bit like season 10 in terms of there was a bit of variety and fluctuation in the deliberations because of the fact that Aaron wasn't helping himself, wasn't doing himself any favors in the deliberation. And I felt like this season accomplished what a season higher up on this list accomplished, just to a lesser degree and within an hour instead of 2 hours. Speaking of 2 hours, coming in at number 9 is season 23, and this is the last of the modern day formulaic seasons on this list. And there's a reason for which this season is actually much higher than the other ones, because unlike the other modern day premieres, this one just leaves me with this feeling that this was a strong start of a new era. I just like the motorboat, Survivor style entrance, and the marching band. And when it came to the cold opening, apart from a few rewards, there were no spoilers, and they still succeeded in making me feel pumped for the season. Ramsay was seen throwing a lot of food in the preview, and we're all getting pumped up for the season because we know it's head chefs only, and so this is going to be like an all-star cast, just not all-stars. The signature dishes seemed like they would be boring on paper just by virtue of this being a strong cast, but I actually enjoyed it because it let us know that these head chefs were not going to mess around. People like Anne-Marie, Yuri, Anthony, Magali, Kyle, Corbin, Hannah, and even Whit to a certain extent established themselves pretty quickly as people to root for, from my perspective. If there's one thing I have to knock so far at this point, it's the fact that the narrator has a tendency to say for the first time in Hell's Kitchen history, and it's been said a little too many times. But then we move on to the punishment pass challenge, and Brittany, even during the signature dish challenge, I find that Brittany could sometimes start off as corny, but she grows on you pretty fast, and by the time the reward comes around, I feel like she has grown on me. And during the punishment pass challenge, you had Megan adding a bit of flair to the situation in itself by saying that she has RBF, and that was kind of funny. And before the punishment pass challenge happened, like I said earlier in the video, Ramsay actually did a little intro to this challenge that actually worked well and didn't make me roll my eyes in corniness. The flamethrower, lighting the torch, and then lighting down the curtain was just perfect. Flambe, And then we move on to the service. The service was one of the best among the newer seasons in terms of entertainment. Both teams got kicked out. It just was a complete contrast to what we were seeing earlier in the premiere. There was more variety in terms of errors on the blue team, but there was something cute and funny on the other side of the red team where Magali and Amber were the only two screwing up. The service is over. Egypt's rivalries with Michael and Brandon get sparked there because there's going to be 2 teams sending up 2 nominees for elimination. And in spite of this sort of entertaining aspect of this premiere, one knock I have to give is that since nearly the beginning of the 2 episodes, Amber's elimination was kind of obvious. Back in the signature dish challenge, we had everybody else getting 4s or 5s, and then you had Amber being the only person to get a 3, which normally is a decent score, but not on this season. And then we get to the service, and she is one of the 2 women to screw up, really, on the red team. And then she does this entertaining move of trying to throw Magali under the bus, but this time it actually works in Magali's favor. The idea of putting herself up to own her own mistakes, unlike what happened with Will/Sarah of season 5. And Amber gets sent home. So that's it. Season 23 had a really strong premiere for a post-season 16 season, except the fact that it is following still the 2-episode format is still a knock for me, and that's why it's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we've got another season with a talented cast, and that is season 14. Now we start off the episode with the bus ride, And right off the bat, Monique asks Allison a stupid question about what native language they speak in Jamaica and is sort of put in her place in the confessionals, and that was kind of funny to watch. In fact, anytime Monique gets put in her place throughout the episode, it's going to be kind of funny for me. And like the season 10 shaved head surprise, the surprise for the season was a fake out, but it was more believable. It's more convincing to viewers that Ramsay would get chefs to jump off a roof onto a safe inflation than having 18 people do this whole season bald. But then we move on to the signature dish challenge, and this is why it's only at number 8 and not a bit higher. It's because the signature dishes were a little bit below average in terms of entertainment, though you still had Josh and Millie with nice sequences, and then you had Krista and Monique that had hilariously bad dishes, and I'll never forget Mika just having this dish that wasn't that bad, but it was all bad. One other thing that makes this season stand out is that among the 10 seasons, this is one of the few where the women are starting off on a bad foot compared to the men. And it's interesting to see, and it's interesting to see the bickering that's going on between some of these women. But onto the men's side, we see them go on reward, and we see them meet William Shatner, which was a nice touch, a bit like Celine Dion. The problem I had with that was that the two men that got confessionals about nerding out by meeting William Shatner were the two men that were wearing glasses, like kind of stereotypical Hell's Kitchen. We had the service, and the service was very goofy, especially from Krisa's perspective, because she was having these moments about like needing to pee, and she didn't know what she was doing. But otherwise, it was really standard for a first service. So we get to the elimination ceremony, and Krisa obviously goes on the block. Monique is on the block as well, and Ramsay also wants to hear from Christine, so we have 3 nominees. And Monique and Krista were both so equally bad that it was hard to predict at 100% who would be the first boot, even though Krista gives more of a first boot vibe. But then ultimately we see Krista leave, and there was even a bit of humor to that as well, because we're getting one last touch at how out of it she was at that point, because she doesn't realize she has to go give her chef's jacket to Gordon Ramsay on the way out. I felt like season 14 was a bit similar to season 23 in terms of the entertainment this time was coming less from the mistakes people were making, and ironically from the fact that, oh my gosh, this time is so good. But the reason why it ranks a bit higher than season 23 is because I prefer these premieres to be 1 hour long instead of 2 hours long. Now at number 7, we've got the premiere of what is, in my opinion, the best season of the series, and that is season 5. We start off in a unique way with 300 chefs being invited and then cut down. That's a positive. And understandably, by that point in the show's history, the signature dishes were the best in terms of quality. But there were still some hilarious bad dishes with funny moments, such as with Colleen. On top of that, you had Danny's half-assed attitude regarding his bad dish, which was a good way to start his arc, and I have to admit it was kind of funny, his response. Gordon Ramsay tells the two teams to come up with team names. In the long run, it was very pointless. It didn't last very long, that twist. On top of that, before the service started, Charlie had to go shave his ginger pubic hair. On top of that, Giovanni was a waiter, and he completely sucked at it, and so that was freaking hilarious. Ramsay tells Danny at one point, now just STFU. And that was right around the time of what was a 20-minute power outage. And then on top of that, you had Seth and Colleen tanking their teams and Ramsay being creative with his insults towards the teams. And all this chaos and pandemonium are just reasons for which this is my favorite season. You could tell that this was absolutely embarrassing for our first service as all the customers had left. But I will say it was after the service ended that things started to go a bit downhill in terms of the episode's narrative. You go back to the dorms, the men had lost, and you had Seth kind of trying to blame Gio for the fact that he was a bad waiter and therefore the team lost because of him and therefore he should go up for a nomination. And then we get to the elimination ceremony, and even though it's clear that Will/Sarah was more supported by their teammates than Seth was, Seth completely throws his opponent under the bus. And I was still thinking that Seth was going to go here, but instead it was unfortunately Will/Sarah who was eliminated, being told by Ramsay, oh, you're throwing in the towel, so you might as well go. Now into number 6, and we've got a season here that's more on the older side like season 5, but brings an extra level of hilarious soap opera style drama that I feel elevates it a little higher than season 5, and that is season 3. Now, right off the bat, we get this cold open that's fairly funny in the sense that we get a montage of Ramsay screaming towards the contestants, and he's just talking to us like he's in therapy, saying that he's going to cool down, he's going to be nicer. We're not stupid. Even him, he says, I'm kidding. We know that's not going to be the case. I'm going to lose my cool. The signature dishes were on par with another season coming up on this list. Going into prep, we see the debut of the Hell's Bitches red team with all their bickering and how it's going to continue into service. But on the flip side, we see Aaron crying before service, which seems a little bit funny on paper, but at the same time, I felt it was kind of forced. But otherwise, this was a really entertaining bad service. You had food having trouble to get out. You had women who were having trouble over a freaking egg. You had Vinny who was told that he had peaked as a dishwasher just because he used water as a stock. Eventually, though, we get to the end of this horrific service, and there's this montage of the red team continuing to bicker and have problems, and customers are leaving, and Ramsay just has enough and forces a shutdown. To fast forward to the elimination ceremony a little bit, I criticized how season 2 and season 3 tried to use the betrayal arc that season 1 had, again, in the premiere. In this case, we had Melissa betraying Tiffany by putting her up on the block. To make up for it, Tiffany did have a bit of karma because we see her and Joanna going up for elimination after throwing Julia under the bus just because of her Waffle House experience. And on top of that, earlier in the episode when Melissa was deliberating over who to put up for elimination, we see that it was kind of handled as in one of the best ways in the premiere out of the classic era seasons. So with all that in consideration, I felt that this was one of the better seasons from before season 6. And it's for all these dramatic reasons above that I feel like it deserves its place at number 6. Now at number 5, we've got the premiere of a season that I felt was inspired by its predecessor that's going to be a bit higher on this list, yet was also inspiring to its successor that I feel is a bit lower on this list, and that is season 8. Immediately, we get this all across America cold open theme. And as much as this season is notorious for having a lot of unlikable contestants making it far, the highlights preview does a good job at compiling a bunch of outbursts from these contestants and Ramsay alike. But then we go into real time and we see the contestants approaching the door and oops, it's locked. And they turn around and they see that their maitre d' is waiting for them. But nope, the maitre d' is not Jean-Philippe, it's James. And I have to admit it was kind of funny because they played it in such an underwhelming way and some of the contestants were a bit underwhelmed themselves. But us viewers were underwhelmed too, so it's like the show was dunking on itself. Additionally, it was acknowledged this time in the narration that Ramsay usually likes to do surprises for the contestants in the premiere. It's just that this surprise, which was to take them to the prize restaurant blindfolded, was a bit bland from my point of view. But from then on, till the end of the signature dishes, there were a lot of funny character moments, such as Emily's breast, Raj's karate kicks, Antonia's gumbo, Raj's pancake, and a chair for Prissy Sabrina. The service was not just entertaining, but it was pretty unique in terms of what was funny or in terms of what went wrong. We had Raj as a waiter. We had Trev failing to dress a salad properly twice. We had Boris mocking Gordon Ramsay and then getting caught for it. And then we had Ramsay calling both teams over just to show them that customers are leaving. The deliberations and the elimination ceremony were a bit interesting and funny. You had Sabrina trying to start a fight with Nona, but failing at it. And then you had Raj's behavior. You had Raj being called out by Gordon Ramsay for having more experience than him, yet failing so badly. And I think the downside to this elimination ceremony, and part of the reason why it's not in the top 4, is because I wanted Sabrina to go home over Lisa. Now at number 4, we've got a season that was executed in similar fashion to season 3's, but the positives outweigh the negatives, and that is season 2. There isn't really much to say, though, I'll admit, about the first half of this episode, but Keith's salad and Tom's Caesar salad during the signature dish challenge were pretty good moments in terms of humor. And you also had a lot of Hell's Kitchen staples that started this premiere this season, such as dividing the teams by gender. And why does this premiere rank so high in spite of not much being said at this point? Well, this service was one of the biggest dumpster fires of all time. We got to see the nighttime prep, which was interesting, and the morning prep as well. But then we get to the disaster. Red team needed 20 minutes for their first app. The blue team was still waiting on apps 46 minutes later. Nearly an hour into service, only bread was reaching the customers. The blue team was finally starting to send out their apps during hour 2, but one of them just didn't have enough pumpkin, according to the client. And that's where Gordon makes his famous, "Right, and I'll rhyme it right up your fucking ass. Would you like a whole or dice?" quote. And then you have Tom, who's kind of being a donkey here, have his pan on fire for the first time, to which Ramsay just tells him that he's about as far away from his restaurant as Ramsay is from home. And then finally, after Polly becomes the kitchen donkey on the red side, Heather takes her place and gets an app accepted an hour and a half into service, to which Sarah funnily reacts in a happy way, and Ramsay just tells her, "Don't get your knickers wet because this is a disgrace." And then we fast forward to 10 p.m., 3 hours into service, and still very little food has gone out. In spite of this being one of the better premieres of the show's history, I still have to give it some criticism in the sense that we had yet another betrayal scene in the premiere right after season 1. But other than that, this is a really good premiere. Now at number 3 is season 7, which I felt was a bit like season 8's premiere, but slightly better executed. There were no flashbacks in the cold open, and there was just the focus on the highlights of the upcoming season, which I felt was a good move. An even nicer touch was when Ramsay guaranteed to the so-called media that the opening service would be complete, and just seeing the contestants' reactions after that was just gold. The signature dishes were all over the place in terms of how funny they were and the backgrounds to them. We had Jamie with her toothpick. Then you had Scott, where he was just talking about how good he was as a chef. And then there's a part just before the official signature dishes where one woman presents her signature dish and it turns out that she is Ramsay's wife in disguise. If there's one thing to criticize with the signature dishes, it's the fact that I felt the editors overplayed their hand a bit with Andrew in terms of that he's this creepy Hannibal Lecter vibe just because he butchers his own animals. Like, there are farmers who do that. I don't understand the problem. But I feel like they made up for it when they played a confessional of him just saying that all he needs for with the money is 2 walk-in coolers. Like, that was just random and kind of funny at that moment. Then I felt a really great distinction with this premiere that pretty much locks this place in the top 3 for me, is that instead of having us studying the menu scene or observing the sous chefs cooking the food scene, we get a bunch of demo videos that the contestants have to watch over the course of a number of hours. Then we move on to service, and apart from Louis in season 6, this episode gave us our first individual kickouts in a premiere, with Fran, Jamie, and Maria all being kicked out at around the same time. Eventually 4 of the chefs joined them. But Service didn't have as many uniquely funny moments as in season 8, but there's still a number to point out, such as the Italian Salvatore burning Capolini twice, there's Fran getting scared of grease and of Chef Ramsay, and then there's Jay getting called Smurf. And then we get to the end of service, and even though the red team was the only team that lost that night, in spite of both kitchens having rough nights in the kitchen, the deliberation of the red team members and the nomination ceremony that followed suit were interesting. You had it kind of being up in the air as for who would go on the block coming into the elimination ceremony, and when it was revealed to be Stacy and Fran just completely tanked her performance, and I kind of felt secondhand embarrassment for her in terms of how bad she was handling herself on the block. I felt that this was a really strong premiere, and that's why it's here at number 3. Coming in at number 2 is the premiere of a season that usually gets a lot of criticism because of how many cliffhanger episodes it has, and that is season 11. Now, this is the best 2-episode premiere cycle in my opinion because I felt that there was just so much good content over the course of these 2 episodes that it just had to be doubled and split into 2 parts, like a certain Harry Potter movie. In the cold open, I felt that there were a little too many flashing Polaroid shots that kind of annoyed my eyes. However, to make up for it, there were a variety of teasers that were interesting. Though I said earlier that I prefer the traditional approach of cooking the signature dishes in the usual Hell's Kitchen set and not presenting them in front of an audience, I felt like this was a nice change in pace at the time. The signature dish presentations were fine to watch, just not as entertaining as even seasons lower than this one. However, Sebastian trying to be a comedian was funny, and Anthony being coached on how to handle his ramekin was just a chef's kiss in my eyes. The bus ride was one of the best punishments to watch in Hell's Kitchen history. There was no AC, there was Sebastian annoying people, there was a Chiron counting the number of chefs that were annoyed by Sebastian. But now the fun part's over for the chefs, it's time to study their menus, and right off the bat we have an interesting moment where Gina starts doing her random puppet crab, and it's provoking the women such as Nedra. And then we move on to prep, and Gina's being a bit lazy during prep, and cliffhanger. I could just imagine myself at the time of the season airing, impatiently waiting a week just to see the follow-up. So then we finish off prep and we're about to start service, and surprise, surprise, we see JP come in. And that was a really nice surprise for the fans because we've missed this guy. Also during the service, there were quite a few unique gaffes, such as Christian uncomfortably pushing out muscles, Jessica cutting lamb like an amateur with a timer on the screen, Jacqueline getting shit just for drinking water, and Danielle being so lost and then asking a bunch of kicked out chefs how many had worked in a brigade before. Speaking of which, this is what really makes this premiere stand out. So many chefs were kicked out of the kitchen, especially on the blue team, and Zach was just beasting it out alone with Christian at his aid at the end of it. And then we get to the deliberation between the men and the elimination ceremony, which were kind of meh, but this was mainly because Jeremy's pitiful attitude was starting to get a bit much, and I was more looking forward to seeing Sebastian stay longer just by virtue of the fact that he had funny moments, but that's just the game. Now again, I feel like season 11's premiere deserves its place in the second spot because I feel like for a 2-episode premiere cycle, it actually hit all the check boxes, and I felt like it actually deserves to be stretched into a 2-episode premiere. It was kind of necessary for this case. Now finally, coming in at number 1 is season 4. And I find that this season executed the older season style of its premiere perfectly. Apart from the corniness, the highlights in the previews were some of the best I've ever seen in a cold open for the show. I think Gordon Ramsay being undercover on the bus with the contestants was one of the best, if not the best surprises of all time, just by virtue of this giving Ramsay a way of getting certain info on contestants that he could use against them eventually, such as when Bobby touted himself as the Black Gordon Ramsay. Gordon Ramsay used that against him a few times in that episode. Then we move on to the signature dishes, and this was, among the early seasons, the best signature dish presentations. We had Gordon Ramsay looking at Craig and his hat and asking him if he had small boy syndrome downstairs. We had Matt's exotic tartare. We also had Petroza and his interesting hen and a pumpkin dish. One small negative I could think of in terms of the signature dishes is that this was the first time where the editors chose to speed through some of the quote-unquote unimportant signature dishes. And then we get into service, and we'll start with the negative in that the captain's twist was pretty irrelevant. We don't even get to see Vanessa Vanessa being a captain much. It was pretty much just used to dunk on Bobby in terms of this episode. To move aside from that, in terms of the positives, we saw the men get this interesting karma right off the bat because they didn't study for service like the women did, and now they're having to pay the consequences. Jason, who was pretty much the donkey of this episode, went for a cigarette break right away. There was the cricket sound effect, the frog sound effect. Speaking of Jason, the best part about him this episode is that he had the dishonor of being the first chef to go eat their mistake in the dining room on a season premiere. But putting Jason aside, even though this service wasn't exactly the worst service on a premiere night, it still was pretty chaotic in its own way, especially on the blue side. You had Bobby's lazy and ineffective leadership where he delegated a bit too much. You had Petroza being nervous in the dining room because he was impatiently waiting for stuff to come out of the blue side. And then you had Ramsay's mockery of Dominic on scallops, which was followed up by him insulting 5 male chefs in one go. More specifically, Bobby, Jason, Dominic, Matt, and Lou Ross. And even on the red side, you had that bit where Ramsay played baseball with Corey's chicken. For obvious reasons, the blue team loses, and then we move on to the elimination ceremony where it seems pretty obvious that Jason and Bobby are going to go up. And why Lou Ross doesn't nominate Jason in the end is beyond me, but he chooses to nominate Dominic and Bobby, which I'll have to admit is a little bit entertaining in terms of the fact that it was a surprise. And then finally, Gordon Ramsay eliminates Dominic, but before that, we see some flashbacks highlighting how exactly Bobby and Dominic screwed up that merited their places in front of Gordon Ramsay that night. And one thing I found that was worthy of a chuckle is that these flashbacks, these highlights, were highlighting how silent and stale these two were during service, which is pretty unique. Ultimately, I felt like my favorite premiere from the series is the one from season 4 because I felt like this premiere somehow managed to check every box possible in the most unexpected way. So there you have it. Which premieres were your favorites? Do you disagree with me? Let me know in the comments section below. Please be sure to like and subscribe to my channel for more good HK content, and here's another video for you to check out. Toodles!